This is Spectrum.
Alternative medicine, homeopathy, secrets, society, hypnosis, the paranormal, alternative, energy, UFO, abduction, the weird, the wild, and the wonderful.
With your hosts, Tom Theophanis and Scott Jordan.
Hey guys, how you doing? Been a long time since we've done an interview. Since July 1st of 2012. We did a short interview just a couple days ago with a gentleman named Harry Fear. He was in Gaza at the time and bombs were falling all around him, so I figured I'd give him a call. He was doing a Ustream. Figured I'd give him a call and do a quick interview with him. Now you can find that in our news section. If you go to the news section, you can see it's the top news story is our interview with Harry Fear. As some of my listeners know, I work in the film industry. That's my real life job. And during the summer and the fall, it's incredibly busy. I just couldn't manage doing the radio show and working in the film industry at the same time. Tom Theophanis, my co-host, has opened a music recording studio, so he's crazy busy. And he'll have some free time in the next couple of weeks coming up, so we're going to be getting together and doing some more interviews. So let's get on with it. Our guest today is Troy D. McLachlan, who joins a number of other writers with an interest in proposing alternative interpretations of human and natural history. A strong proponent of the electric universe theory and the Saturn theory, his first publication, The Saturn Death Cult, is a radical discussion on the links between planetary catastrophism, ancient mythology, and their connection to the ancient and modern occult rituals. Born in South Africa, raised and educated in New Zealand, and now a resident of the United Kingdom, Troy McLachlan spent over 15 years in Hong Kong, alternating between journalism and the film industry. Hey, we got something in common. He is planning a series of follow-ups to the main premise found in his first publication, The Saturn Death Cult, and maintains the website saturndeathcult.com, where he posts supporting articles on mythology, the Saturn theory, occult ritual, and cosmology. Hello, Troy, and welcome to the show.
Scott, hi. Pleasure to be here. Nice to meet you.
Yes, happy to be talking to you. Okay, I've been studying your website, Saturn Death Cult, and in your website you talk about a broad range of subjects. But before we get into those too deeply, I want to talk about what got you interested in the research you're doing now.
Well, it actually goes way back to when I was at university as a kid. And of course, at university, I was studying in Egyptology, Assyriology, biblical studies, and so on. And as we know, these subjects tend to concentrate on what's called a uniformitarian view of history, which is that the present largely gives you the key to the past. That's how archaeologists look at things. And also for those that are involved in the harder sciences like geology. And what shocked me was coming across the writings of an individual called Velikovsky, who gave a completely different interpretation to what I was studying at the time, Egyptian history and so on, and showed to me that there is actually a tremendous amount of evidence that the history of the world, both its natural history and its socio-political history with humans, hasn't been anything but uniformitarian. It's actually been a series of cataclysmic events. The evidence shows that we need to ask these questions, and I started asking those kinds of questions. Didn't make myself popular, but it has always stuck in the back of my mind. And in the last 10 to 15 years, I've got back into looking at the non-uniformitarian interpretation of history, which led me to make the connection with Saturn theory, which is the basis of the cosmology that you read in Saturn Death Cult, the ebook that I wrote to complement the website that is saturndeathcult.com.
Having read a bit of your website, you got into it very deeply.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to cover one subject that I found interesting, and it was about the Golden Age.
Nice.
And what what was the Golden Age, and the perception of what the Golden Age was and what it may be is different.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain that?
Okay, well, Saturn Death Cult refers in terms of the esoteric traditions that humankind has developed in various cultures. I do tend to go with the Western European side things simply because that is the culture I grew up in. But throughout the world, whether it's Mesoamerican, Asian, Chinese, Indian, all these different cultures, there are esoteric traditions that talk about a lost golden age and the hope of a return to a new golden age. And this belief is based on various interpretations of what can only be called Saturn worship, often confused with sun worship, but nonetheless the identification for the original god through which these esoteric traditions take their cue from is the god Saturn, which is identified in Saturn theory with the actual planet Saturn.
Right. Saturn is rife through ancient writings and also in alchemical outlooks. While it's in branding today, you can see that for some reason that archetype has become almost central.
Yeah.
If you look deeply into it, you can see it everywhere.
Yeah, and in Saturn Death Cult, there are certain belief systems that I target. Various malevolent cults, religions, elite agendas, and they are based on the Saturn worship and have this understanding of this lost golden age that Saturn ruled over and desire to return to that lost golden age. And of course, what I do is I tie up a radical new cosmology involving the relationship between the actual planet Earth and the planet Saturn in ancient times, and show how there is an erroneous belief in what transpired and was recorded in mythology. There is a very distorted understanding of mythology that has led to these agendas, is the only way to put it, within these esoteric traditions, to find our way back as a species into a new golden age, but at the expense of vast majorities of humans, purely for the benefit of what I would call a minority elite.
Right, and it's a cosmological outlook. In Velikovsky, the saying is the solar system we see today is not the solar system of the past. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, Saturn Death Cult explores the idea that the ancients experienced a very different and frightening sky to the one we see today, and it advances the notion that the mythological record indicates that our current skies have only been as they are for little more than 2,500 years, which is not a lot of time. And of course, this is something patently rejected by mainstream sciences, mainstream cosmology, that says that what you see has roughly been around for at least 2 billion years, with the occasional problem here and there. But generally, there's a slow progression. What we do is we challenge the uniformitarian view of our solar system's natural history, and we challenge the idea where people have been taught to extrapolate into the past using what they see around them today. And basically, what this really boils down to is that the evidence for this new cosmology is initially drawn from worldwide mythological records that support the idea that the Earth had a previous sun to our current sun, and that the sun was fixed in the celestial north, where the pole star is now, and that this sun ruled from this position as the mythical god Saturn during what is today known as the Golden Age, hence the connection with malevolent cults, certain religions, and elite agendas that refer back to this wonderful time, the Golden Age, and this desire to recapture that time. But we hopefully arrive at a conclusion that shows that the true lost Golden Age was actually a result of many of the catastrophic events depicted in mythology, and that these were natural events witnessed by humans at the time in a world that was very different to the one we see today.
How did that cosmology change, and what did it look like previous, and we know what it looks like now?
Well, okay, so Saturn Death Cult postulates that the Earth and the planet Mars had originally been a satellite of a sub-brown dwarf star that was captured by our current sun in a series of catastrophic events, and that particular sub-brown dwarf was in fact the future planet Saturn. Now that's Saturn theory in a nutshell. The result was that Saturn, on being captured by the Earth, fell from its northern celestial position relative to Earth, where it was banished to the outer realms of the current solar system arrangements. Now, this is completely at odds with the uniformitarian view that has planets forming as part of a circumstellar disk, where the dust and the particles coagulate, or accrete as they call it, and ultimately over time form planets that attract gases around them, and we basically have the solar system as it is. But there are dreadful problems with this theory, that while it sounds great, while it's taught in our schools and most school children are brought up with this idea, there are serious problems with the data that we've collected in the space age in basically correlating this idea with what we're finding of this uniformitarian solar system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so these catastrophic events that we're postulating as Saturn Death Cult, initially where the evidence is, as I said, is depicted throughout the world mythological record. And these mythologies, I contend, have been distorted and misinterpreted to form the corrupted foundation for many occult religious belief systems. And it is from these distortions of natural events that much of today's rituals and dogmas can be traced. And in my opinion, the most outward example of this today, in terms of how it affects us, how it affects you and me on a day-to-day level, is the creation of the central banking model of our current finance system, and its overt use of these deep Saturn-like symbols, Saturnian symbols, that come out of mythology, and they are used to create the aura of legitimacy about the financial system. And I think in particular, the use of the most famous Saturnian symbol, the all-seeing eye, being stamped on every US dollar Federal Reserve bill, is probably the most overt example of this legacy that comes from this ancient golden age into the period that we have today. But it is true to say that for many people, the first hurdle that they face with dealing with Saturn Death Cult is this radical new cosmology. And how can we say something as radical as that the Earth, Mars, and Saturn are literally interpolators into the solar system as we know it today, have arrived late and been captured by the sun, and that this actually happened within the historical record of human beings. In other words, it was witnessed by generations in the past, directly related to those of us today. And I think many people find this one of the more difficult aspects to comprehend. But it's a fascinating form of investigation.
Right, and it falls into the electric universe theory.
Yes, very much so. So basically, what you get is a split in cosmology, which says that mainstream thinking says that the entire universe operates on a gravity-only driven principle, i.e. that mass in the universe is the main force dictating how celestial objects move throughout the universe, whether there's giant stars to small asteroids, planets in between, and so on. And there is another thought there that, in fact, the prominent force in the universe is the force of electricity, and that electricity is carried through the universe through the medium of plasma, which is a fourth state of matter that is very conductive to electricity and that once you factor in plasma and the cosmology that you can build from how plasma works, that we have an entirely different view for how celestial bodies relate to each other based on electrical principles and not just simply mass-driven gravity.
Ah, okay. So what did Earth look like previous to the sun coming into the picture?
Well, Saturn theory that we alluded to when we first started the interview is a subset of the electric universe. Many people involved in the electric universe are concentrating on what we could see today and coming up with very different explanations for the phenomena that we see in space amongst the planets and stars and so on to the mainstream. But Saturn theory looks at the idea of the origins of the Earth and its relationship to Saturn as such. And essentially what that postulates, as I said before, that Earth and the planet Mars were originally satellites of a sub-brown dwarf star. Now, for people who don't know the difference between stars, it's important to understand that the sun that we have at the moment is what's called a red giant. And there are a section of stars which are very hard to detect in space called brown dwarfs. And you can get various sizes and classes of these brown dwarf stars. But we have now come to realize, both the mainstream and alternative research, that these brown dwarf stars that are almost impossible to detect with optical instruments probably account for the majority of stars out there. So when you look up at the night sky and you see all those glowing stars, multiply that by, some people estimate as much as 10 times the amount of objects up there that cannot be seen optically. And the reason for this is that in the mainstream thought, the sub-brown dwarf star or the brown dwarf star, it glows at a very low temperature. It probably has about 700 Kelvin to 1,500 Kelvin in terms of its temperature. So it glows at its light output is extremely small compared to stars such as our sun, and this makes it very difficult for people to detect. What they tend to detect brown dwarfs with are X-ray telescopes and infrared telescopes, which can pick up these signatures a lot easier. And of course, they are finding that these types of stars do exist out there in clusters that they never dreamed possible, and many of them much closer than even the closest stars that we can see with the naked eye. There's been some very interesting revelations of late as to how close these things are. And the reason that they tend to take a lot of time in finding these things is simply because the mainstream was not looking for them to start off with.
Right.
They aimed on, they targeted that which they could see optically. And these sub-brown dwarf stars tended to sort of get lost in that. But now we've got a situation where sub-brown dwarf stars are actually postulated to actually have planets of their own. And this has become very exciting because when you talk about life on other planets and so on, most mainstream scientists will tell you that you have to find a planet in what's called the habitable zone of a
the Goldilocks zone.
That's the one. Not too cold, not too hot. And hopefully as well, the planet is rotating on its axis so that it gets an even distribution of light from its host star, exactly how we find Earth today as it is. And of course, this is once again an example of extrapolating what we see today as the basis for any potential life in other systems. We go looking for what we know today as opposed to other ideas. Now, in the electric universe, some people have postulated the idea that if we really wanted to go looking for alien life forms, the best place to go looking for it is around a sub-brown dwarf star, all right, with radio telescopes, X-ray telescopes, infrared telescopes. Now, the reason that they say this is a fundamental principle of what the electric universe is about, and that is to understand that every celestial body in the universe as we see it has a charge to it. Now, depending, basically relative to other celestial bodies, that charge is electrical. It is either positive or negative. And quite obviously, the larger the objects out there, the more positive they tend to be. So, for instance, in our own solar system, the sun is much more positively charged than the Earth is at this time.
Right.
The Earth is much more positively charged than the Moon, and so on. This tends to be sort of a decent rule of thumb. Now, this electrical nature means that these objects are passing through space, and space is filled with this substance called plasma. And plasma, being a conductive medium, creates an electrical field. So when you get an object, a solid object, or even a gas object with a solid core, such as a sub-brown dwarf star, when you get these objects moving through the greater interstellar space that is dominated by plasma, you're getting a reaction of a charged object meeting with an electrical field. And what that produces is what's called a Langmuir sheath. Now, a Langmuir sheath is essentially a bubble that forms around the object that produces a protective, encasing, almost like a cocoon around that object. And this is crucial for people to understand. Our own sun actually does have this kind of feature. It's called the heliosphere. And I believe Voyager 1, the craft that was launched in 1977, has only just recently, probably a couple of months ago or so, I think, passed through the barrier
Yep,
that they call the heliosphere.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yes, it's enormous. It's over something like 12 billion miles.
It covers our
away
entire
from the
solar
system.
system.
Yeah, it's a huge bubble. So sub-brown dwarfs, being lesser stars, they also have their own heliospheres, all right? Or Langmuir, in electrical terms, that's what's called a Langmuir sheath. And I prefer to use the term a plasma sheath because essentially it's a plasma interaction with a charged body, a charged celestial body moving through space. Now, the interesting thing about these plasma sheaths is that when they're connected with sub-brown dwarf stars, they become very opaque, and they form like I say, a cocoon around the star, and between this bubble and the star itself is actually an amazingly conducive place for the creation and sustaining of life as we know it. In terms of what would be needed to provide life. So instead of looking for a habitable zone around red giant stars that glow as our own sun does, electric universe pundits have said, let's concentrate on sub-brown dwarf stars and look inside what amounts to their plasma sheaths. There you're more likely to find planets, solid rocky bodies that have what's needed to initiate or sustain life as we know it. Of course, this is what we postulate is exactly how the Earth formed under a sub-brown dwarf star that became Saturn, and did so with inside this plasma sheath. And if you remember, I said that the plasma sheath was opaque. So if you have people, sentient beings, whatever, living on such an object as the Earth would have been in that scenario, then the plasma sheath itself operates in such a way as it blocks out all incoming light to those people on that planet.
Right.
Now, the only light they would see would be the dull glow of the core of the sub-brown dwarf star, and that would basically put out a light that is bounced back off the inside of this plasma bubble, this plasma sheath, and it would radiate back onto the planet in a very uniform way so that that planet would experience uniform warmth and lack of seasons and so on.
How about night and day?
No, this is the thing. It would experience night and day if the satellite were revolving around the core of the sub-brown dwarf in the way our Earth revolves around the Sun, i.e. if it were rotating on its axis and also orbiting on the equatorial plane of the sub-brown dwarf. What we find from the mythological record, and this is where it gets interesting, this is the tie-in with mythology and ultimately these guys who want to get back to a golden age. What we find from the mythological record is that the original sun related to basically sat in a static position, all right? And the only way that that can happen is if the satellite that you are on is actually in what's called a phase lock with the core of the sub-brown dwarf, in the same way that the moon is in phase lock with the Earth. So if you stood on the face of the moon facing the Earth, all right, the Earth would never seem to move. If you had one of these curtains, these plasma sheaths wrapping the Earth and the moon, and you stood on the moon, the Earth would never cease to move from its position where you could observe it from the Earth. No matter where you stood on the moon,
right, you
would see the Earth in exactly the same place. And the only reason that we can stand on the moon and understand that we're revolving around the Earth is because we have reference to the sun, other planets, and other stars that move. But if you take away all those outside references and have only the two bodies, effectively the Earth becomes a static object. And this is what mythology tells us, took place in what the nomenclature of Saturn theory calls the purple dawn of creation, a time when the Earth was shrouded in a permanent twilight, a dull glow, with a purple-like atmosphere about it, and with this dull orb sitting statically in what would later be the celestial north. Now, once people have an understanding of those dynamics, how a sub-brown dwarf can harbor a solid planetary body inside its plasma sheath in such a way that you can have this effect of the star's core being a stationary body. What we've described the most ancient experiences of mankind in their mythologies.
So that's a uniform light around the entire planet. Is the Earth spinning?
No. Okay. Where I have to go from here is that because the subsequent history in mythology tells us that an event took place where the star that was seated in the static position flared into enormous brightness, all right? And suddenly the plasma sheath that was enveloping both the Earth and its star disappeared, allowing observers on the Earth to suddenly become aware of the outside universe, all right?
Sounds like a static discharge.
Yes, it is exactly. If we jump ahead to the actual mechanics of what was going on, that's exactly what was happening. And we'll get into that because that's crucial to understanding why I am of the theory that the Earth was not moving around its sub-brown dwarf star, its primordial Saturn, in the way that the Moon orbits the Earth today, i.e. in phase lock. I favor what's called a polar configuration, which puts the Earth actually on a spinning axis, all right, below Saturn's south pole. So if you can imagine that Saturn has a string from its north pole through its south pole dangling down underneath it, all right, then along that string, you've got first Mars, and then you've got Earth at the bottom of the string, and they are in coaxial. They're in a coaxial arrangement, and also they share a rotation on their axis with each other. All right. Now, this is to most mainstream scientists the most implausible aspect of Saturn theory, and of course, I get a lot of people saying this is just complete flouting of Newton's mechanics, celestial mechanics. There is no way that you can have this kind of configuration for celestial bodies. Now, that would have been very difficult to defend for my own sort of theory, had it not been for an event in 1993 when the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 slammed into Jupiter. You probably might even remember
Right.
those events.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yes. And what had happened? Well, it's not the fact that the comet slammed into Jupiter at that time that is of most interest here, because number one, it was vindication of going right back to Velikovsky and his initial theories in the 1950s of planets and collision and so on. People said this just can't happen. Well, there you've got it. You've got a comet slamming into Jupiter and so on. So he was pretty much vindicated along those lines. What is of most interest is what happened prior to the comet slamming into the planet Jupiter. And that was that under stress from coming into the orbital, the gravitational influence of Jupiter, the comet Levy-Shoemaker was originally a solid single object, and it broke up into multiple pieces. And I think there were, from memory, I stand to be corrected, but I think there were about 27 of these pieces. Mm-hmm. But what happened next was unprecedented, and to this day, mainstream science cannot explain why this happened. What happened was that these objects, these parts of the original comet, they didn't become like a train or a disorganized, sort of like, well, how can I put it, like shotgun buckshot.
Right.
You're traveling through space, or like a train with, the first and probably largest part being followed behind by the rest of the other 26 split apart pieces of the comet. What it did was it actually developed into a shape like a string of pearls traveling through space with, the biggest object at the top followed by all the other objects slung underneath the main object. So it was actually traveling around Jupiter on its course to finally being pulled in for its impact into Jupiter. It was traveling as this string of pearls, this polar configuration idea that we're postulating for the way that Earth was placed under the sub-brown dwarf star that we say later became Saturn.
Right.
All right. So we have now observational evidence that what you call polar configurations have been observed. But on top of that, we do actually find that polar configurations are actually extremely common throughout the universe. I think there's well on close to 300 nearly such objects have been found, and they are what's called a Harbig-Harrow object. Now, for most people, these things are stars that have these things called polar jets that come out of the star, and there are sort of these little globules,
right,
all right, that form along these polar jets, all right. They rotate in the same way that we're postulating for the Earth rotating under Saturn. They exist. They haven't discovered a planet under one of these things because they haven't got that kind of, what do you call it, definition. They haven't developed telescopes to really see into those globulars
right.
At this particular point in time. But this goes very much with the electric universe idea of how planets are formed. And contrary to the idea that circumstellar disks are just these giant accreting dust clouds that form around, and it takes over time they all group together. They stick together somehow to form planets, which unfortunately has been shown in mainstream modeling to not really work. They tend to act more like billiard balls rather than sticking together, and so they've invoked, funny enough, plasma, sticky plasma they call it, to try and say, okay, in time they all stick together to form enough of a body to then attract other bodies and grow that way over billions of years. What the electric universe idea is this, that a star, whether it is a sub-brown dwarf star, whether it is a red giant, whatever, is a discharge phenomena within this massive field, electric field, that is permeated with plasma. you get this discharge that takes place. And when you get this discharge, heavy elements within the dust and debris of the universe get attracted into the discharge to form a core. So the electric universe idea is that the heavy elements that make up all this dust and so on literally magnetically get trapped in these plasma pinches, is what they call them, that create these discharges. They form a core, and the core becomes positively charged, all right, as a result. And then you get what's called the phenomena of an anode with a cathode, whereby within this giant electric field of interstellar space, this discharge phenomena throws out its plasma sheath, which becomes the cathode to the anode, which is the glowing part of the star. All right. Now, inside there, you have these heavy elements that become positively charged. But when the whole discharge is put under electrical stress, let's say another object approaches, or there's more positive charge coming in than the discharge can take, you get what's called a flaring or a nova effect. And if it's intense enough, then that solid core of mostly iron elements and so on like that can split. It can have a fracture in it. And what you get is a situation where you have two positively charged pieces inside the star. One that is much larger, you could call it the parent core, and a smaller object. Now, because they are both positively charged, they will repel each other, okay?
Right.
And so that just simply forms, that's an ejection of a heavy element object out of the star. Now, the vast majority of these ejections, it's theorized, will find their way into a equatorial orbit, or some sort of an orbit. We're finding stars with planets around them. They have absolutely crazy orbits. They almost look like the famous diagram of the atom, all those things flying around in different eccentric orbits and such. But occasionally, a piece of this star will be ejected, a part of its core will be ejected along its polar jets, all right? And the polar jets are really what's called Birkeland currents. We have Birkeland currents as part of the Earth and so on. They were discovered by a guy called Christian Birkeland over 100 years ago. Some of this stuff is not new. The thing is that all stars have these Birkeland currents that are the way that the electrical field that these objects move through are connected to the electrical field. It's where the electrical energy is coming in along. Now, these Birkeland currents have a tendency to have parts of them where there's an intense pinching going on. And if a piece of the star's core gets ejected down through a Birkeland current, it will come to sit in a very stable region called a Z-pinch. All right? Now that happens in terms of the Birkeland currents being these polar jets that we see in these Herbig-Haro objects that I discussed earlier. And this is what we're theorizing is the true origins of the Earth being caught under a sub-brown dwarf, that the sub-brown dwarf came under electrical stress. It ejected a piece from inside it that was caught in the Z-pinch of the Birkeland currents that stretch out both the north and south poles of the star. In this case, we were ejected southwards from Saturn and got caught in the Z-pinch, and then over time, the Z-pinch attracts all the elements that need to go into making a planet. Okay, so that is basically the cosmology of how the electric universe describes the creation of planets from stars.
Okay.
And of course, so this is the configuration that the Earth, to use a term I don't like using, but nonetheless evolves over a period of time under its original star, Saturn. And when that star came into the electrical influence of our current sun, the plasma sheath that enveloped the star, that Earth was enveloped inside of, underneath the sub-brown dwarf star, was short-circuited. This is what you referred to as being a discharge event.
Right.
Okay.
Which would cause a massive I mean, that's a massive interaction,
Yes, it is.
which would affect the Earth.
That's right. And what people have to understand is it is the sun's heliosphere brushing against the sub-brown dwarf's plasma sheath. All right, they're both the same things, but the sun being a larger object, all right, was much more positively charged than the sub-brown dwarf star, which meant that the discharge effect was almost entirely transferred into the sub-brown dwarf star. And that would have resulted in the sub-brown dwarf star flaring nova-like, rather than glowing in its dull glow that it had for possibly, millennia, hundreds of thousands, millions of years previous to that. Now, it's the contention in Saturn theory that this moment where the two plasma sheaths interacted, causing this flaring in Saturn, was witnessed by Homo sapiens, humans, actually on the planet at that particular time. And it's what has gone down in history as the Let There Be Light moment of the creation epics that we get in various religions, the most famous being the biblical example, but not alone in world mythology. There is this tendency that this flaring forth of Saturn, the sudden brightening, is what launched the world into its golden age under its original sun. So what was a cosmologically catastrophic event became the catalyst for a sudden explosion in civilization and what humans could do on this planet they had existed on for millennia before. It changed their entire environment in such a way as it inspired them to explore new ideas and basically redefine the new environment they found themselves in.
Wow, that's really interesting. So the sun comes into the system and just jumbles everything up.
Just correct you on that one. It's more that Saturn goes into the sun system. Okay, the existing sun system is catching up with the sun. Quite literally. See, a lot of people don't understand. When they think of north, they think of up and down. All right? North is up, south is down. And we're always shown our solar system as we know it today as like a disk spinning around the sun, like an old-fashioned vinyl record spinning on a turntable. All right? But in the way we are inside our galaxy, we're actually on our side. It's like holding a plate up vertically. Holding this disk that is the solar system vertically, and so north is actually along the arm of the galaxy that we are currently in at the moment, and right. Saturn seems to have drifted into this arrangement, from what would be the south, further down the arm, possibly coming up from below the arm. From where the Sagittarian subgalaxy is currently colliding with our own one, and at that moment, that's when the capture took place. So we are the interpolators into the system, rather than the sun arriving here. And mythology is very clear on this. For many of the more ancient tribes, they talk about the non-existent sun followed by the distant sun, before the sun, as we know it today, took over the role that had previously been that of this northern celestially stationed body. That was Saturn.
Okay, I get you now. So would this account for the stories of the catastrophe in ancient history?
Yes, it would, except that the initial capture is, as I say, it's a let there be light moment. It's the beginning of creation, the creation epics. I'll take the biblical thing. It's day one, let there be light, the first day of creation, all right? And this, you could say, reign of Saturn at that, from that moment on. In the biblical account, it talks about 7 days, and there's symbolic meanings that one can interpret. The point is that when Saturn no longer exists in that northern position, that is when the golden age, or the time of Eden, man supposedly having been created in the sixth day, was in a, this wonderful existence, under the protection of God, or if you look in the other mythologies, the protection of Saturn and how he's named in other mythologies. And then you get this fall, which sees Saturn leaving the scene, and humans being literally chucked out of this paradise, this golden age, and having to fend for themselves. Now, in that sense, the setting up of the golden age was a catastrophic celestial event, and the same thing happened at the end of the golden age. And what really happened there was, jumping from the beginning of the golden age to the end is really the process by which Saturn was still at Earth's celestial north, but under the influence of the encroaching sun, was eventually pushed out of that position, fell, and found its way to the outer realms of the solar system as we know it today.
Right. So the catastrophes, or you could talk about the flood, you could talk about, the Mayans say we're in the fifth civilization, right? Those sorts of mythologies follow along that there were tragic events, at least for us living on the planet, humans living on the planet at that time.
Yes, and what happens here is that the disaster that we allude to, that sees the end of Saturn reigning in the north, becomes the archetype known as Doomsday. This is the we have this wonderful golden age, followed by this catastrophic end that has created an anxiety in all humans that is so deeply etched into our corporate, psyche.
Yeah, like a collective psychosis.
That's right, and it's this fear, and really it's a fear of another doomsday. Coming there. It was such a dreadful experience for those people alive at the time that it has had this effect down through the ages. And of course, this is what I argue in Saturn Death Cult, that when this took place, this set up the process by which various priesthoods, various elite agendas could take advantage of this, the psychosis, this archetype, this fear of doomsday, by capitalizing on the idea that they had the secrets of the golden age when everything was great. All right, they know what the truth of the golden age was, and that they can lead humanity away from a repetition of this doomsday. So therefore, we'd better give them control and let them run the show.
Okay, and this is where you talk about weights and measures that were taken control of and manipulated.
Yeah, for me, it's very important. I said in one interview previously that there's a famous scene in the film Silence of the Lambs where the character played by Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter, basically is admonishing Clarice Starling, the Jodie Foster character, to think in terms of Marcus Aurelius. Ask what is its nature, as a way of solving the crime that she's trying to solve. And if you take the same philosophical idea, ask what is its nature, what is the nature of the golden age that has been related to us down through mythology, you get two competing views. One is what I call the immature view, which is that, hey, it was just a party. Everybody could do what they liked. Nobody had to worry about working. You didn't worry where your next meal was coming. What a great, you sleep all day as long as you like. It didn't matter.
Utopia.
Yeah, it's a utopian sort of ideal that paradise equals not having to work. However, the clue in the mature understanding of what the golden age is found in that Saturn, the planet, which became synonymous with the god Saturn in terms of mythology, was first of all named the god of time. All right, so he's named Kronos in the ancient Greek, mythology, and that's often where we sort of get our ideas of chronology, time, and so on like that.
He eats his kids, yeah.
Yeah, well, yes. In time he does, that's odd. And of course, was capitalized much in the more sort of harrowing aspect of the Saturn death cult that I discuss later. But the original Saturn god that ruled at this time is the god of time. Now, time is a measure. And under the original proto-Saturn, where the Saturn was a sub-round dwarf before it's captured by the sun, there was no way of calculating time in that environment that I described would take place inside the plasma sheath of a sub-round dwarf. You've got uniform light, no seasons, nothing moves in the sky on a regular basis. You cannot tell time through any mechanism, celestial or even mechanical. There's just no concept of time in that.
Right.
What happens when Saturn flares and suddenly the entire universe is revealed to all people inhabiting Earth? And once they get over the catastrophic events that flaring would have created on Earth, they are now confronted with the ability to basically measure time. And it's this measure of time, the idea of days followed by nights, followed by days, the idea of objects that spin in a regular way in the heavens, that leads to the whole concept of weights and measures for humans as a whole. And when you get weights and measures, you get the means by which humans that don't necessarily know other humans can deal. In other words, humans that are wanting to deal, one tribe of humans meets up with another tribe of humans, they can have a set of weights and measures that they can trust that facilitate trade between them. So they can create their correlations in terms of what they want to trade and what its value is. And of course, this brings us to the whole aspect of the one measure that governs us most today. Everybody says time is the great stealer of life and so on like that. But the thing that most of us are governed by is the concept of the measure we call money.
Money, yeah.
Money is a measure of your productive capacity, all right? You make something, somebody puts a value on what you've made, and if they can come up with that value or a definition of that value, then they can make a claim on what you've made or the service that you're offering, and you'll take that as payment. But you've got to have that measure, that concept of money as a measure. And that stems from Saturn being the god of time, this sudden flowering of civilization amongst humans where they can measure everything from the passage of time to their productive capacity.
Right. So that's where, there was a change in the way people dealt with each other.
Absolutely. What it did was it allowed people to deal with people they had never met before and to trade. It allowed people to literally to trust in how to trade, to find means of exchange that didn't simply exist on barter and such, all right? And all these measures would have been formed in the Golden Age, and that really is the strength of the Golden Age, as I understand it, under Saturn, was a period of time when the world operated, humans within the world operated under a set of weights and measures that formed the law by which they interacted with each other. So to me, the Golden Age represented the first time that humanity as a whole entered into coexistence under the rule of law.
Right.
All right. Now that is the mature understanding of what the Golden Age is. However, if you mix into that idea the immature understanding, which is, hey, the Golden Age is really about not working, all right? And you live in a time when the Earth does not produce. You see, in the original Golden Age area, you still had that seasonless environment where the Earth just constantly had a permanent harvest, all right?
Okay.
You never had to worry about storing something for the winter to come through and to get you through to the next harvest. That's right. And so therefore food grew abundantly. You really didn't have to worry about having to create an economy geared to production of food types. It was there all the time. And that allowed people in the Golden Age to concentrate on much more interesting things, like exploring their new world, like getting around and surveying the planet that they were on, looking at the stars, understanding, this entirely new environment that had been born before their eyes. And so it was a great age of discovery, where weights and measures played a tremendous role, in that time. Now, when that got lost with Saturn having been knocked from its perch in the celestial north, as soon as that doomsday event took place, the Earth started to experience seasons because of its relationship with the sun that was now the dominant light object in the sky. And it's seasons that brought about the need to have to plan ahead of
Everything
time.
became more difficult.
Precisely. You had to plan for your harvest, and you had to plan to keep things together. Now, there are a type of people that would have looked back on the Golden Age and would have said, hey, I really preferred that way of living as opposed to this, making the earth yield its fruits by the sweat of my brow, to use a biblical concept. And they would have come up eventually with a solution that they could simply get other people to do all the work for them. All right? They could harness other humans to do that work that made the earth yield its fruit, so that they didn't have to worry about working to maintain a food supply over the winter, then they could literally enter into a golden age type existence for themselves on the backs of these humans that they had captured. When I say captured, the backs of these humans who were doing all the work. Now, you can go about this a number of ways. You can become a tough guy. You can get a gang around you, and you can basically, through fear and intimidation, force people to do the work. But that in itself becomes work. You see what I mean?
Right.
Okay.
Standing armies and the whole bit.
Exactly. You're just maintaining an army and all that sort of stuff. And it only has a certain level. It's very hard to expand. You might be able to control 10 people for every one guy you've got, but at some point these guys are probably going to rebel, and there's all kinds of problems with the tyrannical approach to standing over people and saying you'll now provide me with my meal ticket, from here on in. And of course, the clever way to do this is to get people to work for you where they feel they have to.
People that it's to their benefit to be governed.
Yeah, that's right. And the clearest way to do that is to get them into debt, to appeal to the idea that they owe you their productive capacity and such, right? And this is where we get the idea that at the end of the Golden Age, they developed the whole system of money as a debt, as opposed to money as a means of exchange, being introduced to humans, so that a small minority of people had worked out that if I lend out $10 and want $11 back, but there's only $10 in actual existence, then people are going to get into debt, and that gives me authority over them in terms of foreclosure because they can't pay the debt. The con job is that the $11th that everybody's working for to pay you back doesn't exist. And so therefore, inevitably, whoever lends that original $10 into the community demanding $11 back at the end of the year gets to foreclose on that part of society that can't come up with that $11th. And there's always going to be a small segment of society. So they start to gain land, they start to gain power, and this process is repeated and repeated until you get, in our modern case today, massive, huge national debts, and just general threat of foreclosure on the entire majority of people, to the benefit of the small elite that has had the gumption to con us into accepting that $10 in the first place as a debt.
Yeah, and it's a long-term plan. It's a long-term exercise that if they're the ones getting the benefit from it, they'll want to maintain that as long as humanly possible.
That's right. And of course, it doesn't happen, as such, in a way, that's a simplistic thing, because that's basically the con job as it exists, all right? But let's face it, if somebody came up to you and said, I'm going to lend you 10 things, these 10 items, all right, and they're the only items that exist, but I want 11 back at the end of the year. The 11th one doesn't exist, but I want it anyway, and if you don't give me that 11th one back, I'm going to take your house, I'm going to take, all of your wealth that you work for. You would just tell the guy to go take a hike. You wouldn't fall for the con job like that, all right? So it's got to be dressed up in something that cons people, and this is where they don't come back at the end of the year and say, where's my 11th dollar? What they do is they lend the 11th dollar, but at interest, okay? And the interest accrues over time, but people think, oh, well, they lend the 11th dollar, we've got the 11th dollar, and some people pay back over time. But this builds up over a time where they keep lending what's needed to be paid back, but still at more interest. And this is where the truth of where the national debt really does come from, and why it's ultimately a trap and something that will implode on itself. Now, again, the complexity of a system like that can be augmented if you also harness certain archetypes that came out of the Golden Age, and particularly the terror of the Doomsday event. And this is why so much of these con jobs that are the monetary systems of the past and even today are issued first at what are called temples, places that supposedly have the job of maintaining the knowledge of what had happened in the Golden Age and why the Doomsday event had taken place and what we can do to make sure we don't get caught again in another Doomsday. And these are all the symbols that represent these various facets of that story. And hey, guess what? We're the guys who have been given guardianship of these symbols and ideas. And by the way, we're going to lend you $10, but expect $11 back.
The early priests and kings.
The early priests and kings. And it's one of the reasons why, if you look at every central bank in the world today, the building that they actually exist in, where they do their work, they're all geared out to look like temples.
And they're always the biggest buildings in the city.
They're biggest buildings, and especially if you go back to the Bank of England and so on, but they have that temple facade about them. The architecture that goes into it, I've seen websites that look at the architecture. I've been contacted by people on the subject, and it's true. They've looked at just the architecture there, the way the pillars are arranged, the three doors that go in, all these aspects that are linked back to Saturn archetypes are all there in the architecture. Why don't they stick the Federal Reserve in a glass box like the rest of us seem to have to be put these days when we go to things? They don't. They dress it up in the stuff that is imbued with these archetypes. And of course, that's what they do with their little bits of paper. They stamp all these figures on, these incantations, these little symbols and things like that, okay? And, it has an effect on us, Scott, where we look at it and go, well, these guys, they must be in charge. They know what
they must know what they're talking about. They've got all of their buildings and everything they do written in these symbols of power.
Yeah.
Now, we may not actually, as a general public, know what those symbols of power mean.
Yeah.
But there's a collective psychosis, whereas we understand, okay, they're the guys in power, we just listen to them.
Yeah. And, we have, when you start getting into the conspiracy side of the alternative sort of research, community and so on, of course, we get a lot of people who concentrate on groups such as the Illuminati, and their connection to a lot of these symbols. And I'm often asked, do they know the origin of their symbols, as in it really just comes down to a series of catastrophic natural events that the original priesthoods were trying to, what's the word, put down in writing and codify for us so that we would not lose the knowledge.
And codify it in symbols.
Yeah. Do these guys like the Illuminati and, people behind all these conspiracies today know of the true natural events that are behind these archetypes? And my answer is, I don't believe so. They just understand that these archetypes affect us in a way that is beneficial to their plans. And, so they're quite happy to use this. So when I go to various websites where people are looking at Hollywood and the music industry and saying they're using this symbology, they're using this kind of Illuminati type symbolism and such, the Olympic Games are full of it and so on, all right? I completely
movies
agree.
and TV shows, and it's loaded front to back.
Absolutely, especially in the entertainment industry. And that's been going on, since the Renaissance. And if not further back, it's definitely there. Obviously, it's there in mythology because that's its origins, but it's evolved now into what we see as modern-day entertainment. And I completely agree. Yes, they are using it, but it's not that they have a knowledge to some secret that gives them power. It's that the use of the symbolism is what gives them the power over people who are, whether they like it or not, affected by these symbols at a very deep psychological level.
It's like they don't have to know everything there is to know about it and what it represents. All they need to know is it works.
Yeah, it has the power to do what they wanted to do to get what they want for whatever their agenda is. Now, there is, in my opinion, an agenda born of this this horrendous take on mythology and what happened in natural terms under Saturn. There is an agenda that is steering us towards a cleansing of the planet, whereby the human species is to be reduced at a massive rate so that an elite can re-enter a golden age.
Yeah, well, now that makes sense. And I've often thought about this. And when people say, you got the Georgia Guidestones, you've got a lot of different references to this when it comes to the depletion of the population, eugenics, and all these other things. And to me, it just makes sense when you couple that with technology. Back in the ancient times, you may have needed 10,000 people and X amount of years to create something and, a structure. But nowadays, with our technology, you don't quite need as many people. So at a time, you did not need those people to do what you needed to do to live off their backs, as you say, to live their lives at the at the level in which they want to live them. More power is good, so they want as much as possible. But now with technology and nanosciences and all of these other things, and not to mention science that, is black ops science that we're really not aware of, that the amount of people is not needed.
Yes, that's right. And the technology, sort of the idea that a new golden age will actually be a technologically driven one, dovetails very nicely into, this idea of the breakaway civilization that Richard Dolan has done such good work in looking at. And I'm very interested in that. In Saturn Death Cult, I allude to that as the ultimate goal of where the elite would have us heading. I can remember listening to a guy called Dr. Peter Beta back in the 1980s, who sort of came up with the concept that the elite had this idea that there was going to be a nuclear exchange in the Northern Hemisphere, and the Southern Hemisphere would be the place to be when it happened, and the Southern Hemisphere would be best ruled by a strong navy. So the idea was that the U.S. naval buildup was a great front for building ships and going over cost, going over budget with that ship. But what was really happening was that they were building twin ships, and the cost override was what financed the second ship on the principle that to build two things of the exact same type is cheaper than to build one. In other words, the second ship doesn't cost the same as the first one. And these budget overrides back in the 80s under Reagan and people like that, he was talking about there's a breakaway lot that are hiding in submarine pens and cliff face bases down in Georgia and even down in New Zealand where I've lived most of my life, in the fjords and so on, just waiting for this culling event to take place. And
you make a lot of sense there. It was Ben Rich of the Lockheed Skunk Works. He was a Lockheed Skunk Works director, and he said we had the technology to take ET home.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right.
And I mean that's a Lockheed Martin makes a lot of the secret projects and stuff, and they have stuff that you'll never hear about, or at least you won't hear about it for a long time. Generally, the stuff that's going on in Black Ops programs, you don't hear about for decades, right? So that makes sense to me that they're basically waiting for the calling, because oil, the money that's generated from oil is still very important. The money that's generated from, the control of minerals is still exceptionally important.
Yes.
So as long as that is, which is why you're not going to have any breakout technologies, is because there's still people making a hell of a lot of money on oil and minerals and ownership of countries. But eventually it's going to come to the time when so much has been developed in the Black Ops and that sort of thing that this plan you're talking about to call the human population is when they can come out in the open.
Yeah. However they set about in terms of the mechanics of it, and I mean, I'm very open to the idea that within the elites there's enough squabbling amongst factions in its own right to make the whole thing a very messy affair, no matter how I don't subscribe to an overriding control, sort of the idea of Blofeld and running Spectre against James Bond.
Right.
This idea of a supervillain at the very top. There's as much nonsense going in amongst their own sort of elite factions as they plan for us. And it's interesting. In Saturn Death Cult, what you're alluding to in terms of oil and minerals and so on is all part of the concept that I introduce in the latter part of the ebook and the website, which is the GODS industry, which is an acronym standing for guns, oil, drugs, and sex. And, the illicit drug trade is an ancient one that has also been a source of income for these people. And, of course, we know that white slavery, the prostitution of women and children, has also been an extremely integral part of this whole idea. But, it's interesting. Even in Saturn Death Cult, there are certain things that I didn't put in there, I wish I'd put in, that are so obvious as to why these elites that have this Saturnian foundation, as rotten as it is, to their thinking. And I was watching a film the other day, Clash of the Titans, a recent Hollywood type thing, okay? And so I went to have a look again at Zeus, because by this time Saturn had been overthrown by a son, Zeus, in the mythological stories. To cast a story for your listeners, Saturn, or Kronos, as he was known in the Greek mythology, had become very worried about possibly his children supplanting him. So he decided to eat all his children. And the one child that he didn't get to was Zeus, who then mounted a coup, so to speak, overthrew Saturn, found all the kids that he'd eaten, released them from his stomach, and then proceeded to rule in his father's place. Now, it stood out to me when I went and had re-looked at it. I don't know why I didn't put this in the actual book, but one of the key aspects of Clash of the Titans, the story that you get in the film, once Zeus is ruling the show, is that Zeus has decided there are too many humans on the planet and they've got to be reduced.
Ah.
All right. If there's something that should have stood out in what I was leading people to understand, it's just simply this theme that, thus many humans as is needed to make our lives good and no more.
Ah, brilliant. Actually brilliant. Yeah, no, now you're thinking about that, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to have to go back and watch that movie, of course.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's probably also, a good thing. Just, Wikipedia, as bad as it is as a comprehensive, exhaustive research tool, and that, just go and have a look at, the mythology around Zeus, and you'll see it. It stands out to you that Zeus has this objective of culling the human race. And, when you look at the influence of Zeus, whether it's Jesus, whether it's names of that kind that move into Catholicism, Christianity as we know today, aspects of Islam, aspects of Judaism, and certainly aspects of the Eastern religions, you can see that there is this knowledge there that if you are taking adepts to the more occult, esoteric ideas based on these beliefs, and you can actually show them that there is this theme that we have to sacrifice a majority of people to bring harmony into the world as we know it.
The idea of sacrifice. Now that's interesting. And that is a part of mythology as well.
Yeah, when Zeus wanted to cull the humans, he was talking about sacrificing them.
Right.
So, yeah.
Eliminating them. But interesting, aside from that, is part of the story was talking about how the gods have been losing their power because the worship of man was lessening.
Yes. Yeah, men were starting to become more, how should we say, independent and such. And in Saturn Death Cult, I talk about the 4 ages in the esoteric traditions, which is the Golden Age followed by a Silver Age, followed by a Bronze Age, followed by an Iron Age. And in the esoteric traditions, we are currently in the Iron Age, an age of industry and objectivism and so on like that.
Reasoning.
We discussed the Golden Age and how it fell at Doomsday. When we go into the Silver Age is characterized by the rise of priesthoods who start to codify what was lost from the Golden Age, and that codification process is what becomes distorted through various factions, through the use of the temples, through the idea that you could coerce people through debt into providing a small minority with basically a Golden Age standard of living. And from there, we move into the Bronze Age, which increasingly is marked by mankind deciding that it's not the capriciousness of the gods that matters, it's whether or not I am strong enough as an individual to be a king by my own hand. So we're getting a break from the gods in total. And of course, much of what you see in Greek mythology was formulated or finally codified at the time when the Bronze Age was really starting to come into its own. And that's where in Saturn Death Cult I referred to the warrior kings that developed at this particular time. These are individuals that, because the skies were largely settling down, and they could read these accounts left by the Silver Age priesthoods saying, hey, they had a disaster of immense proportions here, and Venus came down and did this, and Mars did this, and it was terrible.
Yeah,
and they only have to look up
gods.
at the sky.
Gods.
Yeah, and they only have to look up at the sky and say, well, where are they now? This is it starts to become disassociated, and there is a disconnect with the actual historical, natural history that is being related in mythology to what these warrior king types were doing. And while there were a couple of interplanetary events at this time in the early parts, particularly around the exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt, that's related to us in the Bible, but the Trojan War, I point to the events surrounding the infamous Sodom and Gomorrah and so on as being probably the last series of events where interplanetary reactions created disasters on a physical scale on our planet. But since that time, there just hasn't been. You can talk about the wrath of the gods. Well, where is it? Everything's stable up there in the skies.
Okay.
Why are we worried about Mars? Why are we worried about Venus? And, Saturn's a pinprick of light out, on the end. So suddenly we go from the idea of the gods and their capriciousness ruling us and we having to be aware of what they're about to individuals basically saying, no, I'm the guy in charge, and I'll run things as I see fit. Now they had this Bronze Age period where these people become the bully boys of their age, but that doesn't stop what was distorted in the Silver Age from people coming to these guys and saying, hey, guess what? I'll finance you to be the top bully boy in your part of the Mediterranean or China, wherever it is. And this, of course, is where, I link into my concept of the financial system having its origins in ancient Babylon and being the fundamental source of power for what I call the culture of the Saturn Death cult. That's where the influence of what was distorted from Saturn's time in its golden age really shines forth in the affairs of humans today.
But you have writings of rebellion back when Jesus turned over the tables of the moneylenders. That's a story of rebellion.
Yes.
It's like, we don't need to be under your yoke.
That's there is an element of that that comes with Christ. I'm very interested in events that took place simply because the events that Christ was involved in speak of the Jerusalem temple, the one that had been created after the Judahites came back from their captivity in Babylon. It speaks of that temple over a period of 3 centuries or so, and particularly in the century before Christ's birth, becoming what essentially is a central bank for the region. It operated as a central bank more than as a temple. Now, this is completely in keeping with what I'm saying. In the same way the Federal Reserve looks like a temple, well, in the case of Christ's time, the Jerusalem temple operated as a central bank. Nothing changes. There is the same sort of concept. Now, what Christ really represented, in my opinion, was a throwback to the Silver Age of priesthoods, with those priesthoods who started off with the magnanimous objective of codifying the lost laws, weights and measures that had been lost with Doomsday wiping out the Golden Age. And as part of that Silver Age priesthoods, you get one particular priesthood that stands out, which is called the priesthood of Melchizedek. And this was centered around Jerusalem, the city of peace, back in the time of Abraham. So we have Abraham coming into contact with Melchizedek back in his day, which is a good 3,000 years, 2,500 years before Christ. In terms of that chronology.
Right.
And then in Christ's time, you have Christ's followers referring to Christ as the new high priest of the order of Melchizedek. All right? So they're appealing back to this time of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek and the priesthoods there of Abraham's time really are what's behind the law being given to the Israelite people, and such that we see Moses codifying, and so on. So this particular priesthood has its origins in Moses' law, which has its origins in the high priest of Melchizedek that existed in Jerusalem at Abraham's time. And Christ is really seemingly a individual who is reasserting that particular type of thinking, that knowledge of old weights and measures, and reasserting their righteousness by bringing into disrepute what was going on in the temple that was supposedly had its authority from exactly that same priesthood. The Jerusalem temple was centered at Jerusalem, where Melchizedek had originally set up shop. And, so again, we see a priesthood that is corrupted from within, starts to use Saturnian archetypes and so on to, solidify its authority. And over time starts to act as a banking mechanism whereby those people who are involved in that temple, have the good life, have a golden age standard of living, and completely and utterly start to distort all of the laws and weights and measures that the Melchizedek Silver Age priesthood had originally attempted to codify.
Okay. And is there a parallel between that time and this time?
Startling.
I mean, there's a change going on now, at least a perceptible change from where I'm sitting, where people are sort of starting to rebel a little bit.
Yes. I would say that the parallels are startling. I would put down, and this is an area of research which I'll be expanding into in my website over time. I've spoken with a number of people about this and sounded out the idea of what was going on in its relationship to today's crisis. And the more I look into this, it seems to me that the temple at Jerusalem was acting in the capacity that the Bank of England has acted in the last 200 years or so, and that the Roman center of commerce, and you'll have to excuse me, for some reason the name is not there, it's the Vicra Sky or something. Anyway, they had a Wall Street in Rome where a lot of the commercial activity was conducted.
Okay.
So Rome was kind of the New York of its time. Jerusalem was the Bank of England. And I would lump in the Federal Reserve, because as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to Americans, the Federal Reserve is not an American institution. It is an institution under the Bank of England. It's
Right.
the same crowd that operate the whole deal. They're all in it together. And the Federal Reserve was, anybody who'd framed the Constitution with Franklin and Jefferson back in, the time of the founding of the states would be horrified to see the institution that's called the Federal Reserve. So it's really the cat's paw in the new world for the Bank of England, in this modern age. So basically, Rome operates as the Wall Street, where all the commerce, everything is being done in terms of their empire, and Jerusalem is acting like the Bank of England with the Federal Reserve as part of that idea. And the mechanisms that are set up for what became the most destructive crisis, the greatest financial panic, easily one of the top three in documented history, which took place in 33 AD, is fully linked back to this dynamic between Jerusalem and Rome, and this temple acting as a central bank, and has absolutely startling parallels in how it was, as I say, the mechanics, to what we have been witnessing in the last 30 years in today's world.
Right. So from that, can we extrapolate and sort of see if the parallels are current, where we're going?
I believe so. I certainly can. I can certainly point to a couple of things that have to happen in the current crisis that we're in at the moment. Where they will come from, I'm not exactly sure. But what I can do is I can point to where they happened in this parallel crisis in 33 AD. Shall we go there?
Yeah, I want to hear about that.
Okay. Well, you need a little bit of context as to what's going on. As we described, the Jerusalem temple became essentially a national central bank for what was known as the Kingdom of Judea, or the province of Judea by the time the Romans came in. Now, at this particular time in history, I'm talking about the 1st century BC, going up to 33 AD, which is, and you can actually go much further on to 70 AD with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So you've got basically a 200-year period. But in this time, the temple had been, overrun by the Greeks in Jerusalem, and there had been various sort of problems that had being caused, and the Romans eventually supplanted the Greeks in controlling the area, and they set up what was called client kingdoms. And one of those kingdoms was Judea, and the guy who came to basically run the show there was a guy called Herod the Great, who becomes infamous in the Bible as the guy who tries to kill Christ by ordering the death of the innocents. You've probably heard the story.
Yep.
And so on. Much disputed, but that's not our issue as to what happened on that particular occasion. What we need to know is that Herod was Rome's man in that part of the world. And what Herod is known for, why he has the epithet the Great, when a lot of people of the Christian persuasion would say surely he should be, Herod the Terrible or Herod the Evil or something like that. But he's known as Herod the Great because he effectively started a building boom, all right, basically a property boom, but definitely a construction boom in and around Judea that was financed with the money that was collected by the temple from what was known as the temple tax. And the temple tax was this idea that every God-fearing Judahite, Jew at the time, paid a tithe that went to the church and that the temple. And that tithe was paid once a year in September, roughly around the end of the time, called the Feast of Tabernacles. And that money was supposedly a part of Mosaic law that was paid but had to be spent into the economy to stimulate the economy. But what was happening was that the temple was receiving this tax, and it said you've got to pay in silver, the actual money of the time, the precious metal of the time. And if you don't have silver, we can lend you a receipt, a sort of a credit, a bill, pretty much like like a dollar bill represents now, the equivalent of the silver, and you can pay us the silver at a later date, okay? And so what happened was an economy developed where these bills that were lent out for people who couldn't pay the silver at that time were started to be used as actual money within the economy of Judea. And of course, the idea was that if you received one of these bills from somebody who'd borrowed it from the temple, you could then take the bill and receive your piece of silver, okay? But
right.
people stopped doing that as such. They just started simply using these coupons, these bills, because everybody accepted them. And
as currency.
Very few people felt the need to go off and make the claim that of the silver that supposedly backed them. So what did the temple do? They suddenly realized that for every piece of silver they had, they could issue 2, 3, 5, 10, 15. It starts to get up to ratios that we've seen banks do today, where 90 to 1. All right, so you've got 90 bills out there for every piece of silver on the basis that those 90 bills are never all going to come back at one time. All right. However, you set yourself up with this problem. What if 5 of those bills come back? All right. And, well, okay, what if of every 90 that are lent out to one, 5 come back? You have then what's called a run on the bank. They don't have the amount of silver to even cover 5 bills for every piece of silver that's gone out there. Well, this didn't matter because at that time in Roman history, there was a huge import-export trade going on where the balance of trade was very much in favor of those exporting to Rome, where Romans were importing luxury goods, all kinds of items from the east. And most of this trade in some form or another crossed through Judea. The shipping trade or the overland route or whatever came in there. And what would happen is that these bills, what would happen was that these bills that were in circulation in Jerusalem acting as money as part of the whole temple setup, the whole central banking setup that they had there, were the means by which Roman importers could pay for the goods that were being transshipped through Judea. Okay? So Romans needed to get hold of these bits of these bills, these temple type ideas. Now, there are people out there who will have, credentials in biblical history and so on, and say there's no evidence that these bills actually existed. I would debate that, and the current professor of Roman studies at Columbia University, a guy called Harris, has written a whole revisionist thing saying that the ancient world did not just simply function on coin money. There were these bills, these letters of credit acting as money at the time. So I'm quite happy with that this is how, even though we don't have one of those bills, like looking like an equivalent of a US dollar there, and so on, this is how trade was expanded at this time. So Roman importers were desperate to get hold of these bills in order to buy the goods from these people that all these goods that would be transshipped through Judea. So they would take loans of these bills, which would then immediately be paid for the goods, but the loan would ultimately have to be paid in silver. Okay, so a Roman was going to one of these Judean traders, whether it's in Judea or further up at Tyre, and he was saying, how much for that? The guy, how much for your, the stuff that you're bringing through? And the guy would say in return, I would like 100 of those bills. And the guy said, I don't have those bills. Fine, I'll lend you the 100, and then you pay me with that. But when you come to repay the loan that I've lent you, I want it in the equivalent of silver. So what was happening in Rome?
Which would create another bill.
Well, the thing is that what it did was it drained Rome of its silver. And we know that this is the case. Augustus and Tiberius, who followed him as emperor of Rome, were getting extremely concerned and didn't quite really fully understand, why is Roman silver disappearing? Why are we losing it? What is going on? And the reason it was going on was it was being used to pay these debts that Roman importers had taken on with these bills, all right, that were backed by the Jerusalem temple, okay, on a 90-to-1 basis, as high as that, all right. So all this Roman silver is going back. Well, this is a great game, because the temple, it meant that the Roman silver could then be used by these Judahite, Judean traders in around Phoenicians and people like that to pay their tax. And what they were doing is they were taking the Roman silver, melting it down, and turning them into Tyrian shekels, all right, or the shekel of Tyre, the city of Tyre. And this was the only silver that the temple accepted. Well, you can imagine the temple in Jerusalem was becoming absolutely inundated with silver, Roman silver, and this was what was used to fund an expansion in infrastructure by Herod to keep facilitating this trade. The only trouble was that as more and more Roman importers took on the debt of the initial bills that were put into the Judean economy by the temple in place of silver, more silver was being drained out of Rome to go to pay off this debt when it came due. And so essentially Tyre and Jerusalem became a money laundering operation for Roman silver that really started in time to bother the Romans on a big scale. And you start to see they become very interested in what the hell is going on in this Jerusalem temple and what is happening. Now, without going into too much detail, this trade led to an imbalance of trade between the Roman Empire and what was being shipped to it from the outside that put a lot of people in Rome in debt in terms of they were mortgaged to facilitating that trade. Now, where the parallel happens here from what's happening today is that this is no different to the predatory lending. In other words, the Judean merchants that were lending to Roman importers is no different to what the banks were doing to subprime borrowers.
Of course.
A few years ago, right? And all it took, as we know, a few years ago, do you remember when the subprime crisis hit in the United States? People were aghast because it was kind of like So we've got people reneging on paying their debts, and this is causing a problem. But it's only 5% of all the debts who are reneging. What is the problem? And they didn't realize that when you lend out 90 to 1 or 40 to 1 or such, you only need a 5% default ratio
Right.
to wipe out the capital that backs all those loans. All right?
And once it started, it steamrolled.
That's right. Once it started, it's a set of dominoes that went on all the way down the line. Now, this is exactly what was happening to the Roman importers. Think of them as the subprime borrowers, and think of the merchants backed up by the Jerusalem temple as the predatory banks in the banking system backed up by the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. All right? This is basically the same parallel that took place at this time. And where it gets very interesting to me in relation to the historical character Christ marching into the temple and wanting to chuck out the money changers is that the effect is this. If Christ were being brought up in this environment, we know very little about what happened to him from his birth to the age of 12. And then from the age of 12 to the age of 29, we know even less about what he was doing.
Right.
Okay, so there's a lot of theories out there. Some of them I subscribe to. Some of them I think are, off the chart in terms of credibility. But the thing is we can all agree that the Bible itself is extremely silent. And in fact, when you look at the biblical account of Christ, the first public episode of his ministry, when he starts his ministry, is the event where he goes into the temple and causes a ruckus, wanting to throw out the money changers.
Right.
The only thing he does before that is he's at a private wedding and he turns the water to wine, all right, which is all done in a private context. But the first public event is this chucking out the moneylenders. Now, what a lot of people don't understand about the Christ figure is that to qualify as the Messiah of the Old Testament, the prophesied Messiah, the first thing he would have to be was somebody who very much adhered to the laws of Moses. He couldn't go around not adhering to those laws and be taken seriously by the people in Judea at that time. And one of the key aspects of Mosaic law is that every 49 years you forgive a debt, any debt that is owed to you. No two ways about it. If somebody owes you $1 million and they still owe it to you after 49 years, every 49 years, debts like that are completely wiped out and everything starts again. Now, in the time that Christ was between the age of 12 and 29, if in fact he was like anybody on this planet and needed to make a crust, we can assume that he possibly was involved in commerce of some kind. And it is strongly that this might be the case because of his relationship with a biblical character called Joseph of Arimathea. And there's enough evidence there to show that Joseph of Arimathea was very much a captain of industry in his own right at that particular time in history. So Christ was rubbing shoulders with an extremely important businessman. And when I say Joseph of Arimathea was a captain of industry, I'm talking about at the level that we would look at somebody, like Rockefeller, like Carnegie.
Yeah, one of the elite of today.
One of these big guys. Forget about Buffett and Bill Gates and so on. I'm talking about the mega industrialists of the Gilded Age, the robber baron time. The Vanderbilts, these kinds of people. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of guy that Joseph Arimathea could rub shoulders with in his time. And this is who Christ seems to have had a very close relationship with, even by biblical accounts. So Joseph Arimathea is very much linked into the trade in shipping. And this particular trade was dominated at Tyre and such, and was very much a part of the export trade that we talked about with the Romans getting into debt. Now, if Christ had in fact been involved in this trade, he would have been involved as a partner in one of these import trades. That his benefactor Joseph Arimathea was involved in. And the key here is that he would have, under biblical law, been perfectly entitled to lend at interest to Roman importers who were seeking to take whatever goods they were shipping through Tyre. And this would have been perfectly fine in the eyes of anybody looking to qualify as a Messiah. The point is that when that 49th year came round, if any Romans owed him a debt, he had to have forgiven that debt. There was no two ways about it. Now, the Jubilee, as it's called, at that time comes around in the year 26 AD. And it's around this time in 26 AD that you get a catastrophic collapse of an outfit called Malchus and Co., which was the great Tyrian. It's a business in Tyre that used to make what's called Tyrian purple. This dye that is an incredible dye that actually becomes more bright under the sun than fades like other dyes.
Okay.
A cloak made of Tyrian purple would cost about $60,000 by today's rates.
I wonder if that reflects to royal purple.
It's totally royal purple. That's exactly why royal purple is like that. And if you also take into account that Christ, on his crucifixion, the biblical account talks about the robe that he had, that the soldiers cut his clothes up into quarters, but the robe they decided was too nice, and so they cast lots for it to see who would get that particular robe. That robe was made of Tyrian blue, which is a derivative of Tyrian purple. And the cost of that robe would have been enough to set up any Roman in his own farm back in Rome, if he wanted to. So these are indications that
so
Christ
not
was
beggar on the street.
Sorry, exactly. Yeah, he wasn't your average sort of street revolutionary that people have so often liked to portray him. He moved in circles that were extremely well appointed. What I'm saying is that in 26, to qualify as a Messiah, any Romans that owed him a debt, in fact, anybody who owed him a debt, had to be forgiven. And what we find is that the Malchus situation starts off with what they say was an embezzlement of money by a manager working on behalf of one of the owners at this particular Tyrian purple place. Now, this Tyrian purple dye shop was a huge business at the time, but it was extremely leveraged in the way that Lehman Brothers was leveraged in terms of loans going out to importers and such like that. So that, to give you a scenario, if you had Christ working as a partner there, taking on loans, and deciding in 26 AD that he was going to forgive every loan, it would have had the equivalent effect of 5% of Lehman's mortgage borrowers defaulting on their loans. It would have triggered the dominoes, and those dominoes over a period of years culminated in what became the financial crisis of AD 33, the year that Christ was in fact executed for his pains later on. But not that I'm making a connection there specifically with this. What I'm saying is that the act of Christ simply adhering to the law of forgiveness of debt could have been the trigger in Tyre that got this whole ball rolling. It's crucial also to understand that effectively the reports we get of the House of Malchus is no different to what we see a lot today in these big banks that are having all kinds of problems. They keep claiming rogue traders did it.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, we know it wasn't rogue traders or anything like that. It seems Malchus and Co. did the same kind of thing. Hey, we got embezzled. We had a rogue trader. It didn't stop the dominoes from then starting to cascade through the system. And by 33 AD, it was a full-blown financial panic on a par with what we are facing today, what the European Union in particular is facing today, what the United States will face probably early next year when things go absolutely belly up in the European Union, as they mathematically will do so.
Yeah, mathematically non-recoverable.
It just can't be done. And where I find this interesting parallel to answer your question about, does this give us any scope for plotting out how things will turn out? All right, rather than looking at Christ as the tragic figure who's executed, and then according to the Christian religion is raised from the dead and forms a church, and the disciples then go out into the world. Don't look at that story. Look at the effects that what happened in the Roman capital itself, where Tiberius Caesar was running the show there and was very much at the forefront. Remember I told you that his predecessor, Augustus, had told him, and he himself was extremely worried about the loss of silver out of the Roman Empire. Okay? Now, Tiberius was immensely wealthy. He had inherited over 100 million sesterces from Augustus. That would have put him in the same league as John D. Rockefeller, when John D. Rockefeller, in inflation-adjusted times, could call upon $456 billion in cash.
Right.
It dwarfs Buffett and these guys. So Tiberius was actually in that league in terms of his own personal wealth. And it is very interesting to note that Tiberius had a lifelong friend in a guy called Thrasyllus, who was his astrologer. And Thrasyllus was a Greek who had come very much into contact with old biblical concepts to do with how kings should rule their people. And if you look closely into the Mosaic laws of how a king should rule, you get something that's totally opposite to what we see in the royal family in England, to any royal family we actually see anywhere in the world. And in biblical law, if it said, if you choose one to rule over you as a king, first of all, he is not to accrue money to himself. He's not to become rich. All right?
Right.
This is one of the crucial factors that comes out as to what a good king in biblical law would be about. Now, Thrasyllus was very much schooled in biblical law and was the close confidant till his death of Tiberius Caesar. There is no way that, given Tiberius's love of rhetoric and astrology and all things to do with philosophy, that they would not have at some point discussed Mosaic concepts of how a ruler would rule.
Yeah, and if they were very close friends, they would exhaustively discuss it.
Precisely. You can imagine also that in the throes of a financial crisis, this kind of advice, this looking for anything to do with how to deal with the situation, would also be discussed, and it would sort of come about that, in my opinion, they would have an understanding that the crisis had initially started as a result of what was going on in Tyre, linked into the central bank called the Temple in Jerusalem. And that's why you get this ongoing antagonism between Rome and the Temple that culminates in the horrific rebellion in 70 AD, when not Trajan, was it Trajan? Titus came on the scene and dealt to the temple once and for all and crushed it. All right? So it's my opinion that if you've got this crisis as developing since 26 AD, you then have this public incident in the temple in a crucial area that the Romans are really looking at and going and starting to come to a conclusion that this is where the source of their silver losses and some of their problems, that this would have made an impact. It would have been known that Christ's actions in trying to throw the money changers out, or an event of that kind, whether it was Christ himself or his followers or whatever, would have come to the attention of the Romans, because they themselves were becoming very iffy about the effect that this place was having on their own economy. And if they had discussed Mosaic law and seen what Christ had done, or what somebody had done in terms of trying to clean out the temple, it would have been apparent to them that maybe the key to this was to act in a way that was opposite to how the temple itself was acting. The temple was preaching Mosaic law, but it was not acting in accordance with that Mosaic law. It wasn't cancelling debt. It wasn't doing any of these sorts of things. And what we find is that Tiberius Caesar, this incredibly rich man, in 33 AD, literally gives his entire fortune to the Roman people to help them get over the credit crisis, and effectively stops it becoming a full-blown, cataclysm that destroys the Roman Empire.
Right.
That's never been done before in history, as far as I can work out. I don't think any ruler in that position has ever said, "I will give up everything that I claim as my own to do that." It's a remarkable, an absolutely remarkable event, which he's actually vilified for by many of the Roman historians later on. They call him a grumpy guy and he's a terrible man. Yes, oh, cracky, you wouldn't want to cross Tiberius Caesar. But then that goes for most of these Roman guys.
Right.
At the time. But he is significant in that he totally gives up all his worldly wealth to serve the Roman people. In other words, he follows the Mosaic laws of what a king should do regards coin.
All right. So can we expect the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers to give up everything they have to...
Well, you see, this is where I am very optimistic. Okay, it's not that they're giving up their worldly wealth, Scott. What they are currently doing is they are taking on the sovereign debt of all these countries that are getting into trouble by buying up sovereign wealth bonds. They're doing it because they believe that these countries will absolutely force their taxpayers to back that up. That if things get into trouble at the end of the day, the taxpayer will be called upon to back this up. But we have this extremely strange situation going on where all the major central banks in the world, and by that I'm talking about the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the Federal Reserve, and to a certain extent, the Japanese have been doing that, but I always believe that the Japanese Central Bank has just been a client of the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve.
Right.
And such.
A branch office.
Yes, exactly. The incredible thing is that these banks are now taking the debt onto their books in the full knowledge, as far as they're concerned, that it's not a risk because, we have the government so much under our control. They'll just enforce the taxpayer to pay it. Okay?
So power and control.
Yes, absolutely. They, by taking on this debt and rescuing the system, so to speak, that's what they believe they're owed. I believe that the debt will become so large that people will see it to be so. It is this way now. There's no way that the taxpayer is going to allow any government to sign off on the idea that this whole debt will now be paid off by generations to come, multiple generations to come.
So when the government bailed out the banks, the vast majority of people did not go along with that decision, and the government did it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, I mean, there's going to come a point where the vast majority of people don't agree with something, and the government can't get away with doing it anyway.
Yeah, and what I think will happen is it won't be a case of sort of like the people rising up against the government and saying, you can't do this, get back our money. It'll be just simply that the whole world will simply lose faith in the US dollar, in the euro, in the British pound. And that debt that they're taking on will become worthless. It just simply will not be seen as money by people. And at that point in time, whoever then introduces a precious metal-backed currency, and I believe this is exactly what Germany and Russia are setting themselves up for, will take over the role that the United States has enjoyed since the Second World War as the world's reserve currency. But as far as that debt to the Federal Reserve goes, the American people will be freed from it. And not because of the niceties of the people who run the Federal Reserve, unlike Tiberius, but simply because it's just an inevitable consequence of, creating debt where the numbers are stupefying.
Right. It becomes an unmanageable situation.
Yeah, and we've got plenty of commentators out there. Favorite saying, a guy called Mike Shedlock often says this, that it's just a rule. A debt that can't be paid won't be repaid. And, until people realize that the debt that the Federal Reserve is taking on for itself cannot be repaid, so therefore it won't be repaid, and it will be like, there you go, guys, you now got the debt on your books, you're bankrupt.
Right. Exactly. It'll just grind to a halt.
Yeah.
And what's to replace that? That's interesting.
Yes, what's to replace that? I have certain views which are probably, given our timescales, too much to go into. However, I do believe that in Saturn Death Cult, I allude to the research of an author called Joseph P. Farrell. He's done fantastic work in looking at at the creation of a superstate called the Nazi International. And I believe that there is a third player at work behind the scenes that its most, how could you call it, its most salient existence in the world today is the Bilderberger collective of people that meet every now and then to decide things. I believe that the Bilderbergers are actually the remnants of what was the Nazi project under Hitler and so on, with the Anglo-American establishment, and how they are reorganizing or have attempted to reorganize Europe in the form of what became the European Union and the final currency, the euro.
Yeah, that's working out well.
Yeah, totally. And that's breaking down. And if Joseph Farrell is right, there is this marker or this payment that's due from the Anglo-American banking establishment to an investment made by Martin Bormann on behalf of the Nazi International, which happened after the fall of the Nazi regime in Germany. And that payment cannot be made at the moment because of the problems that the Anglo-American banking establishment is having. And behind the scenes, there is a death struggle going on between these elites. And as part of that death struggle, we should see the result that a unified Germany will start to grow closer to the Russian country. I was going to say the Russian bear, simply because what Germany can bring to the table in terms of manufacturing might and financial prudence, Russia brings to the table in terms of still the only country who can really face up to the United States war machine.
Well, hasn't Germany been bailing out the different countries in the EU for EU?
No,
for a while
again,
now?
not quite. Again, it's the ECB, the European Central Bank, who's been doing the bailouts on the basis that they believe that they will get the Germans to back that bailout. All right? And the Germans have been demurring on this, all the way through. Merkel knows that the German people think this is a crock. Why should they pay for the prolific idiocy of Greece, Italy, and Spain, and probably France now? Because they're in this stupid thing called the euro. She knows she's got that domestic problem on a huge scale, and knows that, and the ECB knows that they have to get her to agree to backing these bailouts. Now, the dynamic at work here is that the Germans might do that if they can turn around and say, we want collateral for it. And the collateral that they will accept is the gold and precious metals held by the Italian central bank, there's the Spanish and so on like that. And that's why, in literally bringing us right up to today, we're now seeing the Germans saying, where is our gold, to the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, where their gold is supposedly stored. And we're having the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England sort of, coming out with excuse after excuse,
right. Shuffling their feet and looking
exactly.
around.
Because they all know that the gold is gone. It's been rehypothecated and sold out. To these things, and the German gold hoard is gone. But the plan of the Germans had been that if they can get hold of Italian gold, Spanish gold, even the French gold, but just if they got hold of Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian gold, combined with their own golds, they would have more gold than the United States, which would mean they could then, also in combination with the Russians, who have more gold than anybody else underground, even more so than South Africa has now, they could seriously launch a gold-backed currency. But it seems to me that particular plan is, there are problems on the horizon simply because the German gold hoard might not be there in physical form.
Right.
And this is where I have my theories, again, too complicated to go into, but based on the idea that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. I believe that the Germans may actually turn to silver as the alternative to launch a precious metal-backed currency to destroy the United States' hegemony in reserve currencies.
So a manipulated switching of power base.
Yes, and this is one of those things that it's hard for us in the West to stomach sometimes. But if you look at Merkel, if you look at Putin, if you look at the Chinese leadership, I'll take Putin as an example because he came on the scene roughly about time when George W. Bush was running things in America.
Right.
Now we all know, Bush with his malpisms and. Sort of whether or not he has a credible intelligence or not is open to debate. One thing we do know about Putin, on the other hand, is that this is a man who flew fighters in the Russian Air Force. He knows how to pilot one of those. He's a Top Gun. He's
so
a
did
chess
Bush,
master.
didn't he?
No, Bush flew transports.
Ah, okay.
So on like that. He had a very limited sort of thing. He wasn't anywhere near in the Top Gun side of things. Putin, on the other hand, is also a chess master, a grandmaster at chess. He's a judo aficionado, black belt in judo, which is a form of combat that concentrates on the idea of using your opponent's strength against them. All right?
Okay.
So he is imbued with the whole idea of letting the opponent come at you and then positioning yourself 4 or 5 steps ahead of them to take advantage of their slip-ups as they rush forward. The American concept has always been, we've got the power, we've got the firepower, we'll just barrel on in there and we'll set the whole thing up, and nobody can go against us. Merkel, on the other hand, is a woman who has a doctorate in chemical biology. She is an extremely educated woman. And the funny thing about Merkel is that the only language she speaks outside of German is Russian. Now, that is a very strange thing for many of the post-war German leaders. They've all spoken English to some degree because English became the world language because of the hegemony of the British Empire and the and the United States. It was more, how would you say, it was a better choice to learn English if it was going to be if you were looking for a second language and didn't speak English.
Right, just for interaction purposes.
That's right, because that's where the business was done. We led the world, the English-speaking world did in terms of commerce and political hegemony, all these sorts of things. She chose to speak Russian. Now, Russia and Germany have got closer and closer, particularly in terms of the energy supplies coming in from Russia into Germany, particularly with Germany's huge doubts on how this whole central banking model with the euro and with what the Americans are doing is going to work out. They take on this debt, coupled with Russia's experience in the early 1990s when they were virtually raped by the proxies of American banks, these guys they called the oligarchs. And you have this picture emerging of this closeness between Germany and Russia. And that closeness is one that says we possibly, even if we can bring China into our sphere of thinking, and Putin and Merkel have spent more time going to China than they ever had to America to talk with people there and sort of deal with things. A classic example, Putin went to the Olympic openings in Beijing, but he refused to come to London.
Right.
All right, much closer than Beijing, but that's how he decided to do things that way. Now, that combination of countries that is growing together are doing so on the basis that they are fed up with being dominated by the US dollar in terms of their trade, and the US dollar then dictating geopolitics in terms of the American war machine being brought to bear on anybody who decides they don't want the US dollar. And they've been working towards a way to circumnavigate the whole influence of the American dollar. And if anybody really wants to get a handle on how this is shaping up, particularly with the Chinese idea, I cannot recommend more highly Jim Rickard's book called Currency Wars. It's not a long read, right. But it gives you the full details into what how we are now fighting a world war with currencies, and that war is now being fought between the Anglo-American banking establishment, the what you would call the non-aligned, the Chinese, the Japanese with their currencies. The Russians are involved in that, but there's this strange influence in Europe. We call it the EU, but under this whole influence is what I believe is the long-term planning of Martin Bormann when he knew that Hitler had lost the shooting war. He set into motion a series of financial blueprints for basically capturing the financial future of Europe, so that Germany could achieve a position of power in Europe without having to send tanks and guns in.
Right. Financial manipulation.
Totally.
Okay. Wow. You believe over 2 hours has gone by so quickly?
Oh, I do. I can see it.
And there's I've got a list of a bunch of different things I wanted to cover, and we didn't even get to it.
Yeah.
I'll close off by asking you, and this is a question I had, and I'm going to jump to a parallel of today.
Yeah.
You've got a current event going on with Jimmy Savile, and it's a scandal that's going on now, but that sort of parallels something that's been going on for a long time. But it was known but not publicly known in the past. And more of this stuff seems to be coming up. You could probably describe this controversy a lot better than I could, but there are parallels.
Yes, and it's an area that's in Saturn Death Cult I allude to, which, to put too fine a point on it, is the disappearance of children, down through the ages, and of course the pedophilia that is endemic within certain Saturn Death Cult culture type occult groups that are out there. I'm not saying that Jimmy Savile was involved in the occult in any way, but to give you listeners who might not know this particular scandal, Jimmy Savile was a very popular, iconic television host with the BBC in the United Kingdom over many years, from the late 60s all the way up to the early 90s. He used to run a thing called Top of the Pops. He was the presenter of that. He had his own radio show, and he was knighted for basically being an icon of the British entertainment industry. And even during that time, there were many rumours as to his predilection for young girls, but these weren't taken seriously and were largely swept under the rug. Well, since his death last year, in the 12 months since he's died, the scandal has erupted that shows that, in fact, he may have actually been the most prolific pedophile in British history. And there are many other people who claim that it goes much further than that, that in fact he was procuring for a pedophile ring that reaches all the way up to the number 10 Downing Street, into Parliament, into the very highest echelons of the establishment in the UK. And he was actually very friendly and an invited guest on many occasions to parts, with the royal family. So you have these connections that are being made by people in relation to this guy having now been exposed as a pedophile. What I find interesting about it is that the pattern seems to have almost been a template for what was going on in many other countries where these kinds of scandals have broken, but don't have the legs to stay in the public mind all that long. And I refer to the Cassiopeia orphanage event in Portugal, nearly 15 years ago, up to 20 years ago when it started, or even longer back then, where orphanages were raided by pedophiles to take kids off to sex parties and so on. And of course, one of the guys who's been convicted only in the last 6 months, it took 10 years to bring him to trial and have him convicted, also was a television personality, a talk show host, this kind of thing. We have the same problem in Belgium surrounding the Marc Dutroux case, where this happened. And of course, this all dovetails horribly with the accusations that have proven to be true concerning the Catholic Church and its pedophile priests.
Kevin Annett.
This is it. This is a man who has been saying this all along, that this goes so deep and is so widespread and has particularly horrific consequences for the indigenous populations of Canada and possibly even the United States, but definitely Canada. And of course, Kevin's received, a hounding from the authorities over the stances that he has taken. Must be feeling somewhat vindicated because, here we go. We've got something that nobody would have dreamed would have been exposed for those who knew it, and for those who didn't, wouldn't have dreamed that it was real in the first place.
Not only just exposed, but accessible and known by a great deal of people. Because, even if you go back to Boys Town and all that stuff that was happening, the big foot came down, the suppression foot.
Yeah.
It's the same foot that came down in the Vatican. Same, and this is a repeating scenario over time, and it's gone back. Like I say, I would take it back to thousands of years even.
Yes.
I don't think this is nothing new.
No, it's definitely nothing new, and I don't know the psychology all that much as to what pedophiles get out of what they do. On my website, I deal with the work of Stanley Kubrick and look briefly at his film AI, which is the story of a 12-year-old boy who's really a robot, being created to be a perfect replica of two parents' child. And Jay Weidner, who's looked at Stanley Kubrick's work and so on like that, claims, and I agree, that Stanley Kubrick in that story probably was trying to expose this pedophilic element throughout the world, simply because what class of people would love a child to simply stay at 12 years of age all his life?
Yeah.
It's all pedophilic.
What's the psychology behind that?
Precisely. And, this Saturn Death Cult alludes to this. As I said, I tried to get into people's minds by constantly referring at about this time more children were going missing. We have horrific episodes down through history. The Children's Crusade, all those kids sold into slavery when they thought they were off to the Middle East to convert the heathen.
Yep.
And, it's down there through the centuries. But in my opinion, the top elite, they may indulge in all this, but pedophilia and procuring children for these sorts of things and so on often acts as a control mechanism for keeping people in line.
I was going to say exactly the same thing, a control mechanism.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I write about this in Saturn Death Cult. And I put this kind of stuff started as early as 2000 BC in terms of historical documentation. For any Christians out there who want to take up the idea, in terms of the biblical record, just simply look at the at Chronicles and the books of Kings, and you see an absolute catalogue of pedophilic kings, down through the line, practicing these abhorrent, crimes on children. It's there in the Bible, extremely obvious. So, there's the Bible reporting exactly that kind of thing from biblical times.
Yeah.
It's been a part of our culture, down through the ages. And there's plenty of writers who've done far greater research than I have, people that I rely on to get my information. But as a final, sort of statement on all this, in relation to Jimmy Savile and so on, when you read about the amount of children that go missing, and I've seen official figures as much as 700,000 kids in the United States alone go missing every year, and I've done mathematical, equations that if you decided to say, well, 0.001% of kids are actually ending up in some kind of horrific experience to do with ritual murder or ritual abuse, that kind of thing, you still end up with between 7 and 9 kids a week being taken.
Astounding.
Yeah, and unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. And I just, I trace this all back. I harp on it a lot, and people who've listened to me in other interviews, oh, there he goes again, I'm sure. But I trace this back to the love of money and the mechanism that is the central banking model with money issued as debt as being the facilitator for all of this kind of thing. I don't think you're ever going to get rid of the pedophilic impulse in certain people.
Right, and where that comes from, which is possibly because money and power and this the pedophilia does seem to be connected overwhelmingly.
Yes.
So there must be some sort of schism in their personality that is introduced to allow that behavior to be the norm.
Yes. And if your entire trust for who you are and what you do is predicated on a trust in money, then you are, if the rumors are true that people like Savile acted as procurers for wider pedophile rings, and so you've got to ask, what was the payment? Well, whatever the payment is, it's still a form of money, and it becomes that love of money that becomes this driving force for, as I say, facilitating, this kind of behavior. If we can somehow get rid of our fight in society where somebody always loses, because if I go back to that $10 lent in but $11 demanded back, we're always got a part of our society, and it grows over time, that is fighting for that $11. And it's not there. They're
Right.
fighting for nothing. So somebody always has to lose, and people who lose get desperate. And then they can be taken advantage of. And, in-step the pedophiles, in-step these things. And if you join the elite, they've learned that one of the great, it's not that they're holding people over. And I think I said this to you off the air one time when we were discussing some of these aspects, that these people are not being held sort of like, we've got the negatives of you, the
Right.
film footage of you doing it. All you have to be is told, you are now one of us. You're part of what we do. And, and then you will start to behave along the set agenda that these people promote.
Right, especially if you want to keep doing what you're doing. And you can use hope and dream. You don't just have to use fear of losing.
Yeah.
You can use hope and dreams. Like the hope is, I want to be an entertainment icon. I want
Fame.
to be. Fame.
Yeah, fame is a currency that is often used. I will also say that in Saturn Death Cult, I also write and allude to the international drug industry.
Right.
And I don't simply mean what today are classed as illicit drugs. While the emphasis was very much on opium, the poppy plant, the poppy flower as a source of it, I also allude to the pharmaceutical industry as being involved in this whole,
huge,
dumbing down this sorcery. In biblical terms, they talk about the sorcery. It's from the word pharmakos, meaning pharmaceutical, where we get pharmaceutical from. So in my opinion, it's really a reference to chemical, stimulants being used to also, along with, sexual ritual and appealing to that, drugs can be used as control mechanisms for people, and that's been a part of their whole God's industry: guns, oil, drugs, and sex.
There's a lot of tools in the toolbox.
Yeah.
And you can use any one of them or multiples.
Yeah.
And it basically, like you say, comes down to money. And maybe backing that is just manipulation and control, having control and keeping control. And if money is a tool to do that, if pedophilia is a tool to do that, is the need and want and desire for fame to do that, then that is the tool that gets used.
That's correct. Yeah. Perfect summing up. This is how it's perpetuated down through the years, down through the centuries. And to bring it full circle, Scott, when you're asking about a golden age and a new golden age, the simple motive is that there are certain elites out there who want a golden age now, and they can get it if we can provide it for them by our work and basically by not calling them on things. If their idea of a golden age is a form of sexual paradise on things that are not acceptable to the majority of people in society, pedophilia, for example, all right, then as far as they're concerned, they will work towards a system that means that we provide them with the capacity to indulge this, but are too in debt, too pushed under to really call them on it.
Exactly. I mean, there's a point where you're at the bottom of the pool and you've got no more breath left.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do at that point? You're going to take a breath, right?
Yeah.
So, wow, I've still got a list of questions, Troy. I didn't even get to. I wanted to talk about ancient megalithic structures and, how the really old structures are better than the new ones, and sort of maybe reflect that back on your golden age and silver age, and how you almost got a degradation in skill when it comes to the ancient structures that happens. The really old ones are made better with larger blocks, and they're larger edifices, they're larger megalithic structures, and then the later ones are more like copies.
Right.
And I wanted to get into that too, and I had a whole bunch of stuff I wanted to get into, but I think we're going to have to do another show.
Okay, that's fine by me.
And cover a lot of these questions that I have that didn't get answered, because your answers are so detailed that you're not just giving me a point answer. You're giving me an extended version. Okay, to look at this, you need to know a little bit of history.
Right.
And that's what's extending our discussion. So, man, I really appreciate you coming on. Could you give everybody your website and how they could get in there and read all of this stuff? Because you've written this all out on your website.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, Scott. And for anybody who wants to, look at the sort of written efforts that I've got, saturndeathcult.com is the website. I have an ebook by the same title that's available at Amazon. It could be downloaded to Kindle or to the Kindle software on the PC if you have that. And basically there you can get the introductory story that Scott and I have been discussing through this radio interview. And there's also a lot of visual aids there in terms of diagrams and artwork to help visualize some of these concepts.
And Kindle version is color.
Yes, if you've got the Fire version of it, you can get it on color. I think the older Kindles still do it as black and white. Most of those pictures on my website were calibrated to look better in black and white. But it is actually, I prefer seeing it in color.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely amazing. I highly recommend anybody to go download that, read it at your leisure. A lot of the information is on the website. It's a very comprehensive website. You're coming out with a new book soon. When is that going to be released?
Ooh, it's an ongoing project. I've got a couple of things that I'm involved in, but in terms of much what we discussed in relation to the banking crisis of AD 33 is my top priority at the moment. And I'm in two minds at this stage how to present it. I may present a non-fiction synopsis. And by that I mean something probably the length of Saturn Death Cult,
Okay.
in the same language.
Which is expensive.
It's a diagram involved, which is basically a correlation of all my notes that I built up on it. But it's my intention also to inject a bit of, take it into the arts realm and possibly dramatize events in the form of a novel, which may take me, with the notes I've got, may take me a good 6 months to a year before that format comes out.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Troy. My guest is Troy McLachlan, and he's been very helpful and informative, and we're definitely going to have to do this again. Thanks a lot.
Hey, Scott, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye. And we'll see you guys next time.